Welcome back. Chapter 2. The First Condition. The drive from Sydney to the Blue Mountains had never felt longer. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel of his battered Toyota Ute so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Every few minutes he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced he was being followed, though the winding mountain road behind him remained empty. Jeffrey Whitmore's words echoed in his mind. "They'll know you're coming before you know they're there." Jake had tried to dismiss it as the paranoid rambling of an old lawyer, but something about the way Whitmore had said it made his skin crawl. The GPS announced he'd reached his destination, and Jake pulled over to stare at 47 Cliff Road, Laura. The house was nothing like what he'd expected. Instead of some grand mansion, he found himself looking at a modest Federation-style home with wrap-around verandas and weathered timber cladding. It was beautiful in its simplicity, but it hardly looked like the home of a man worth $50 million. Jake killed the engine and stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The late afternoon sun filtered through enormous eucalyptus trees, casting long shadows across the property. The silence was almost oppressive after the constant hum of Sydney traffic. He found the key exactly where Arthur's letter had said it would be, taped under the rusty mailbox that bore the faded name, a Mitchell. His hands shook slightly as he peeled away the old tape. This was it. Once he used this key, there was no going back. The front door creaked as it swung open, releasing the musty smell of a house that had been closed up for too long. Jake stepped inside and fumbled for a light switch. Ancient floorboards groaned under his feet as he made his way through the entrance hall. The house felt frozen in time. Furniture from the 1980s filled rooms that hadn't seen much updating since then. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, but Jake didn't recognize any of the faces. On a side table, he spotted a framed photo of a young man in army fatigue. The face was familiar, though Jake couldn't place it immediately. He picked up the photograph for a closer look and nearly dropped it. The young soldier looked exactly like his father, or rather, exactly like Jake himself. The resemblance was so striking it was almost like looking in a mirror. But the uniform was wrong, the style too old to be his father. "Great-Uncle Arthur," Jake whispered, setting the photo down with trembling hands. For the first time, the reality of having family he'd never known truly hit him. This man, this stranger who'd apparently watched Jake's life from afar, had once been young, had once served his country, had once had dreams and hopes just like anyone else. But according to the lawyer, Arthur Mitchell had also been a man with dangerous enemies and deadly secrets. Jake shook off the unsettling feeling and focused on his task. Find where the truth was buried with the roses. He needed to locate the rose garden before darkness fell. The backyard was larger than it had appeared from the street, stretching back toward the cliff face that gave the road its name. And there, in the center of a well-maintained lawn, was the most spectacular rose garden Jake had ever seen. Even in the fading light, the garden was breathtaking. Dozens of rose bushes formed intricate patterns, with winding gravel paths weaving between them. Red roses, white roses, yellow ones, pink ones, every variety Jake could imagine, and some he'd never seen before. Someone had been caring for this garden recently. The roses were perfectly pruned, and the soil around them looked freshly turned. Jake walked to the center of the garden, where a small wooden bench sat beneath a trellis heavy with climbing roses. A brass plaque on the bench caught his eye, in memory of those who kept the secret safe. A.M. "The secret," Jake muttered. But what secret? He began walking the path systematically, looking for anything that seemed out of place. The garden was immaculate, almost too immaculate. As he knelt to examine the soil more closely, he noticed that while most of the garden looked well established, there was one section where the earth seemed different. Newer, less settled. It was a small area near the back corner of the garden, planted with white roses that looked younger than the others. Jake ran his fingers through the soil and immediately felt something that didn't belong. Not quite buried deep enough to be hidden, but not sitting on the surface either. His heart pounding, Jake began to dig with his bare hands. The soil was soft and came away easily, as if it had been disturbed recently. Within minutes his fingers struck something hard and metallic. A safe. Jake stared at the small fireproof safe that was now partially exposed in the rose bed. It was about the size of a shoebox, with a digital lock that glowed softly in the gathering dusk. But what made his blood run cold wasn't the safe itself. It was what was lying on top of it. Fresh roses. 3 perfect white roses that had been placed on the safe's lid, their stems, still green, their petals still firm. Someone had been here. Recently. Jake spun around, suddenly aware of how exposed he was, in the garden. The trees that had seemed so peaceful earlier now looked menacing, full of shadows where anyone could be hiding. His eyes swept the property, looking for any sign of movement. That's when he saw it, a brief glint of light from the house next door, like sunlight reflecting off glass. Or the lens of binoculars. Jake's mouth went dry. Someone was watching him. Forcing himself to remain calm, Jake turned back to the safe and tried to look casual as he brushed more soil away from it. The digital display showed 8 blank spaces. He needed an 8-digit code. But what could it be? He tried the obvious things first. Arthur's birth year, death year, the address of the house. Nothing worked. Each failed attempt made the display flash red, and Jake was acutely aware that someone might be watching every move he made. Think, he told himself. Arthur had left clues in his letter. Find where the truth was buried with the roses. But maybe there was more to it than just the location. Jake pulled out his great-uncle's letter and read it again by the light of his phone. Something had been bothering him about the wording, and now he saw it. Certain letters in the message seemed slightly darker than others, as if they'd been traced over with a pen. Findtr. UTH. When he connected the darkened letters, they spelled out a phone number. No, not a phone number. 8 digits. 427.8.198.5. Jake's hands shook as he entered the code into the safe. The display flashed green, and he heard the soft click of the lock disengaging. Inside the safe were 3 items: a stack of old photographs, a handwritten journal, and a newspaper clipping yellowed with age. Jake grabbed all 3 and quickly closed the safe, pushing soil back over it. He needed to get inside the house before whoever was watching decided to make a move. As he hurried back toward the house, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted. Every rustling leaf, every creaking branch made him jump. He fumbled with the back door key, desperate to get inside and examine what he'd found. Once safely inside with all the doors locked, Jake spread his discoveries on the kitchen table, under the harsh fluorescent light. The newspaper clipping made his stomach drop. The headline read, "Gold Heist, Nets Thieves, $12 million Police, Baffled by Elaborate Scheme." The date was February 15, 1985. The article described how a group of thieves had stolen a massive shipment of gold bullion from a security company in Melbourne. But what caught Jake's attention was a grainy photograph accompanying the article. It showed 3 men in ski masks being led away in handcuffs. The caption identified them as suspects in custody, but Jake recognized the build and posture of one of them. He'd seen that same stance in the army photograph on the mantelpiece. Arthur Mitchell had been involved in a gold heist. The journal was even more revealing. Page after page of Arthur's neat handwriting detailed the planning and execution of the robbery. But what Jake read made him realize this wasn't a simple theft. It was something much more complex and dangerous. According to Arthur's account, the gold shipment was a cover. The real target was a collection of documents that were being transported with the gold, documents that proved several high-ranking police officials and government ministers were taking bribes from organized crime syndicates. The gold theft was meant to look like a standard robbery, but Arthur and his partners were actually working for a federal investigator who was trying to expose the corruption. The operation had gone wrong when their contact in the federal police was murdered, the night before the heist. Arthur and his team found themselves in possession of both the gold and the incriminating documents, but with no one left to trust in law enforcement. "We became criminals to catch the real criminals," one entry read. "But now, we're all marked for death." The photograph showed faces Jake didn't recognize, but the final image in the stack made his blood run cold. It was a photo of his father as a young man standing next to Arthur outside what looked like a courthouse. On the back, someone had written, "Tommy Mitchell, killed for knowing too much. His son must never find out." AM 1995. Jake's father hadn't died in a car accident. He'd been murdered. The journal's final entry, dated just 3 months ago, was a message clearly intended for Jake. If you're reading this, then you've completed the first condition and learned the truth about your father. I'm sorry, Jake. Tommy was killed because he wanted to turn in the documents and clear our names. The corrupt officials we'd tried to expose found out about his plans and made sure he couldn't talk. The second condition will be harder, but it will put you on the path to justice. Go to Melbourne, to the old Mitchell's Bakery, on Swan Street in Richmond. Look for the place where we used to count our blessings. You'll need this key." Taped to the bottom of the journal was a small brass key. Jake sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. His father had been murdered by corrupt officials who were still out there, still in power. Arthur had spent 40 years running from the truth, and now he was passing the burden of justice to Jake. But Jake wasn't sure he was ready for this burden. He was a carpenter, not a detective or a vigilante. What could he possibly do against people powerful enough to have gotten away with murder for decades? A sound from outside made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the house. Jake quickly gathered up the photographs and journal, shoving them into his jacket. He turned off the kitchen light and crept to the window, peering through the curtains. 3 figures in dark clothing were moving across the property. They weren't trying to hide. They wanted Jake to know they were there. One of them was carrying what looked like a crowbar. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You have something that belongs to us. Come outside and we can discuss this civilly." Another text arrived immediately. "Or we can come in and get it. Your choice." Jake's mind raced. The back door was closest, but it would take him toward the cliff face, a dead end. The front door led to his car, but he'd have to get past at least one of the men outside. Then he remembered something from his childhood, his father teaching him that when cornered, sometimes the best escape is the one nobody expects. Jake grabbed a chair and climbed up to check the ceiling. Sure enough, there was an access panel to the roof space. If he could get into the roof and make his way to the other end of the house, he might be able to drop down and reach his car before they realized what was happening. The panel came away easily, and Jake pulled himself up into the dusty darkness, just as he heard the sound of breaking glass from the front of the house. They were inside. Moving as quietly as possible across the roof beams, Jake could hear the men below, searching the house. Their voices were calm, professional. These weren't random criminals. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done this before. "He's not here," one voice said. But he was. "The safe's been disturbed. Check the journal. See if it's still there." "Gone." Along with the photographs. "Boss isn't going to like this." First time in 40 years someone's actually managed to complete Arthur's little treasure hunt. Jake reached the far end of the house and found another access panel. Below him was what looked like a bedroom. He could see his car through the bedroom window. So close, but the men were somewhere between him and freedom. "Spread out," the first voice commanded. "He can't have gone far. And remember, we need him alive until we know how much he's learned." Jake lowered himself down into the bedroom as quietly as possible. The floorboards creaked softly under his weight, and he held his breath, waiting to see if anyone had heard. Silence. He crept to the bedroom door and peered out into the hallway. One of the men was in the kitchen, his back turned as he searched through drawers. The other 2 were somewhere else in the house. This was his chance. Jake slipped out of the bedroom and moved toward the front door, keeping to the walls where the floorboards were less likely to creak. His car keys were already in his hand. He made it to the front door and slowly turned the handle. The door opened without a sound, and Jake stepped out onto the veranda. "Going somewhere?" Jake spun around to find the third man, standing in the shadows of the veranda, smoking a cigarette. He was tall and lean, with the kind of face that had seen too much violence. "Just getting some air," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're Jake Mitchell, Arthur's great-nephew. We've been waiting a long time to meet you." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." The man dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. "Here's the thing, Jake. Your great-uncle stole something that didn't belong to him. We've been very patient about getting it back, but patience has its limits." Jake could hear the other 2 men moving around inside the house. In a few moments they'd realize he wasn't there and come looking. "What did he steal?" Jake asked, stalling for time. "Documents. Very important documents that could cause a lot of trouble for a lot of important people. People who don't like trouble." "I don't know anything about any documents." "But you do now, don't you? You found Arthur's little hiding place in the rose garden. You read his journal. You know about your father." Jake's blood turned to ice. These were the people who had killed his father. The man stepped closer, and Jake could see a gun holstered under his jacket. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give us everything you found in that safe, and then you're going to forget this whole inheritance business. Walk away. Go back to your little carpentry jobs, and pretend none of this ever happened. And if I don't—" The man's smile widened. "Well, let's just say that car accident's run in your family." That was when Jake's fear transformed into something else entirely. These people had murdered his father. They'd spent 40 years covering up their crimes, getting rich while his family struggled. And now they were threatening to kill him too. Jake pretended to reach into his jacket as if he was going to hand over the documents. Instead, he grabbed the heavy brass door knocker and swung it as hard as he could at the man's head. The man staggered backward, blood streaming from his temple, and Jake ran. He sprinted toward his car, fumbling with the keys. Behind him, he could hear shouting as the other two men burst out of the house. His engine roared to life just as someone fired a shot that spiderwebbed his rear window. Jake floored the accelerator and tore out of the driveway, his tires screaming against the asphalt. In his rearview mirror, he could see the three men running toward a black sedan that had been hidden behind a neighboring house. They were going to chase him. The winding mountain road that had seemed so peaceful earlier was now a nightmare of sharp turns and steep drops. Jake pushed his old ute harder than he'd ever driven it, taking corners that made his tires squeal in protest. The black sedan was faster and better maintained. It was gaining on him. Jake's phone rang. Without thinking, he answered it. "Jake Mitchell." The voice was calm, professional. "Yeah? This is Detective Inspector Reynolds with the New South Wales Police. We understand you're in some trouble." Jake nearly sobbed with relief. "Thank God. Yes, there are 3 men chasing me. They tried to kill me. They're in a black sedan. I know exactly where you are, Jake. I need you to pull over so we can help you." Something in the man's voice made Jake's blood run cold. It was too calm, too controlled. And how did he know exactly where Jake was? "Who did you say you were again?" "Detective Inspector Reynolds." "I'm here to help you, Jake, but I need you to stop the car." Jake looked in his rearview mirror. The black sedan was right behind him now, and he could see the driver talking on a phone. "You're one of them," Jake whispered. "Now, Jake, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Pull over, and we can sort this out like civilized people." Jake hung up and threw his phone out the window. The police were corrupt. Arthur's journal had been right. The conspiracy went all the way to the top. He was completely alone. The road ahead split into 2 directions. Jake could continue down the mountain toward Sydney, where he'd be trapped in traffic and easily caught. Or he could take the smaller road that led deeper into the Blue Mountains, into the wilderness where he might have a chance to hide. Jake yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, taking the mountain road. Behind him, the black sedan followed. But as Jake drove deeper into the darkness of the Australian bush, he realized something important. He wasn't running away from the truth anymore. He was running toward it. And somewhere out there, in the second condition that Arthur had left for him, was the key to bringing down the people who had killed his father. The chase was just beginning.